Whether you watch as a wide-eyed fan or through your fingers, horror films have dominated the box office for decades. But did you ever wonder why some horror movies get under your skin and stay there for years? Aside from the fun of simply having the shit scared out of you, they take our real-life anxieties, manifest them on screen, and tap into the instinctual fears that reside deep within our psyche. While the term horror film wasn't mainstreamed until around 1930, the first horror movie on record is believed to be 1896's Le Manoir du Diable, The House of the Devil. In the years that followed, early horror films adapted popular Gothic literature like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Edgar Allan Poe's The Haunted Palace, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Between the 1930s and 1950s, Universal Studios released a series of horror movies with monsters as the driving force, and never looked back. The appeal of films like Dracula, The Mummy, The Wolfman, and Creature from the Black Lagoon lies in their ability to tap into social anxieties and transform them into fiction. Take Frankenstein, for example. Released during the height of the Depression, Frankenstein's monster, abandoned by his master and turned on by the villagers who tried to burn him alive, was the embodiment of the millions of Americans who had just lost their jobs and were fleeing the frustration and neglect of their government. The monsters on screen allowed audiences to address their fears without looking at them too directly. This takes us to the 1950s, where the aftermath of World War II and the Red Scare was terrifying Americans, and this manifested through our monsters on screen. Monsters like Godzilla or the supersized ants in Them embodied the unknown repercussions of the atomic age and the perpetual fear of a future apocalypse. And the spread of communism and the mass hysteria of McCarthyism played out on screen in Invasion of the Body Snatchers as the pods slowly open and the aliens, who appear to be physical duplicates of the townspeople, emerge. But Hollywood was not prepared for what would happen in 1960, when a single silhouette would change the industry forever. Alfred Hitchcock. It all started with the clatter of shower curtain rings, followed by a shot of a deliberate blade taking aim at a naked female body, blended with a haunting score. The lingering, vulnerable, blood-curdling screams of Janet Leigh is what haunts audiences to this day and set the scene for the scream queens who would follow, including her own daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis. But we'll get to her later. With Psycho, Hitchcock took horror films to a new level, introducing audiences to a flawed heroine and challenging his audience's stomach for blood. To take it even further, the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, along with the Vietnam War, exposed the violent and brutal ways in which humans could harm one another. And you can't mention horror and leave out Night of the Living Dead. This film was made before the MPAA film rating system went into effect and shown during Saturday matinees, which meant that young children were in the audience and probably scarred for life. Considered one of the most violent and bloody horror films of its time, it also set box office records, proving that despite the gore and terror of being besieged by flesh-eating zombies, people enjoy the escape from, or perhaps the parallels to, modern-day life and political turmoil in America. As the violent horror and imagery of the Vietnam War, the first televised war, was broadcast on the nightly news, horror movies took advantage of the times once again. In addition to becoming more gory and explicit, the horror genre explored sexuality, particularly among teens. That brings us to the genre's next evolution, through the use of what are now some of the most obvious horror movie tropes of all time: the final girl and death by sex. Both of these tropes were explored to great success in John Carpenter's iconic 1978 film Halloween, and while her mother may have originated the title Scream Queen, no one wears that crown better than Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode. Strode was the virginal suburban good girl. Her purity would be her saving grace. Her more promiscuous friends fall prey to the knife of Michael Myers, while she's always just missed. And even when she's cowed and trapped in a corner of a closet, she maintains the ability to defend herself and eludes death. Subliminal message? Sex leads to falling prey to bad things. Speaking of prey, recognize these two notes? Everything about this epical opening scene from Jaws of two drunk teenagers running and stripping their clothes as they head to the water, only to have everything go terribly wrong, reads as a morality tale. What better way to drill the message about the dangers of alcohol and sex than being attacked by a 20-foot great white shark in the film's opening scene? The amount of remakes and use of excessive gore spilling over from the 80s ultimately grew tiring to audiences in the 90s, when the tone shifted to being more self-referential and reignited the slasher and supernatural subgenres. In films such as Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer, the teenage characters were now snarky, emo, and self-aware. And just as those subgenres evolved with the times, so did psychological horror, focusing on what truly made a killer tick. 24/7 news coverage and the emerging popularity of true crime revealed the scariest monsters were real and human and living among us. And no one was more terrifying than Dr. Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs, though Annie from Misery may be a close second.
I love you.
Lecter was the serial killer who lived next door, but he was not your cardboard villain.
Pity about poor Catherine, though. Tick-tock, tick-tock.
As played out through his various interviews with Clarice Starling, Lecter exposes his vulnerabilities and seduces us with his humanity, only to brutally remind us of his taste for flesh, paired with fava beans and Chianti. The popularity of teen-focused and psychological horror films continued into the 2000s, but parallel to the growing trend of reality shows on TV, a new subgenre emerged and changed the game in viewer experience and storytelling: found footage. Films like 1999's The Blair Witch Project paved the way for a shift to horror minimalism. Think low budget, high thrills, and high box office return. The amateur video element of these films is what makes them so creepy. It gives the impression that the situation playing out on screen could happen to anyone. And with the war on terror in full swing by the early to mid-2000s, the majority of horror movies focused on humans doing whatever they could to survive the evil around them. The fear of doomsday re-emerged into the zeitgeist with the help of movies like 28 Days Later. Jordan Peele's 2017 film Get Out was Oscar-winning proof that horror, both in movies and in real life, can take many different forms. Peele expertly wove together the subgenres of psychological and technological horror, while also examining the traumas of modern-day society and institutionalized racism. While the horror genre bias is real, these are several horror films that garnered Academy Award nominations for Best Picture: The Exorcist, Jaws, The Sixth Sense, Black Swan, and Get Out. But no horror film achieved the level of success of The Silence of the Lambs, which received 7 nominations and went on to win the Big Five: Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Picture. The only horror film to ever win that category. So even if critics do not always embrace horror the same way they do most Jennifer Lawrence movies, this genre has been able to last because it consistently looks at cultural markers as an opportunity to redefine itself. And so, in honor of the latest revival of his classic film Halloween, maybe we should just leave it to director John Carpenter to sum it all up. Horror is a reaction. It's not a genre.